development and use. And just to say a few words before I go on to introduce Eleanor, just to let you know that during the session, while people are presenting, your microphones will be muted, but then when we come to questions at the end, we'll unmute people who've posted questions, so you can post questions in the chat function, and we'll try to go through as many of those as possible. And anyone who's got a question, we'll unmute and show you a video at that point to put your question. So as I say, I'm delighted to introduce Eleanor Perfetto, who is Senior Vice President of the Strategic Initiatives for within the National Health Council in the United States. And very recently, Eleanor has been promoted to Executive Vice President. Eleanor also has, alongside that role, a part-time faculty appointment at the University of Maryland with the Baltimore School of Pharmacy, where she's Professor of Pharmaceutical Health Services Research. And Eleanor's work focuses on patient engagement in comparative effectiveness and patient-centered outcomes research, and also medical product development and patient-reported outcome selection, development, and healthcare quality. So delighted to hand over to you, Eleanor, and I think Sarah will be showing your slides.
Yes, and Sarah, you can bring those slides up now. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. It's really an honor to be involved in this program. I'm really happy to talk to you about what I'm going to be presenting today is the patient community perspective. We're a patient advocacy organization, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that. So it's really the role of what the patient advocacy community can bring to the table when we're talking about core outcome sets. You can go to the next slide, Sarah. I want to start with just a little bit about the National Health Council so that everyone understands the perspective that I bring. The National Health Council is a not-for-profit organization. It's located in Washington, D.C., and it's a membership organization. We have members, but they are not individual people. Our members are all organizations. And we are 100 years old this year. 2020 is our 100th birthday. And we had a lot of great parties and things planned to celebrate our 100th birthday, and all of them got canceled. And hopefully we'll be able to have them next year when we hit 101. But we are an organization of patient groups. And so our membership consists of organizations, all kinds of organizations, but per our bylaws, the largest number, the largest group in our membership must always be patient advocacy organizations. And so here on this slide, you see the over 60 patient advocacy organizations that are in our membership. And many of you might recognize some of the common names that are here: the American Heart Association, the American Cancer Society, American Diabetes Association, Arthritis Foundation, Alzheimer's Association, all of those organizations that are related to patient groups that represent individuals who have chronic diseases and disabilities. And in the US alone, that number is over 160 million people with at least 100 chronic disease and or disability. So we like to say that we represent the voice of all of those patients, but we represent them through their patient advocacy organizations that we bring together. Next slide, please. So I want to begin with a few definitions in the way that we at the National Health Council use them when we talk about things like patient centricity, something being patient-centered, or something like patient engagement. We define them as, so beginning with patient-centered, any process, program, or decision that focuses on patients, but it's in which patients play an active role as being meaningfully engaged participants. And the central focus of that activity is to optimize the use of the information that the patient provides. So it means doing things with patients, not doing things for patients or to patients, but actually bringing them into the process, engaging meaningfully, hearing what they have to say, and then working with them to use the information that they brought to the table to improve whatever that activity it is. And that activity could be It could be creating a core outcome set. It could be creating a patient-reported outcome measurement tool. It could be enhancing drug development or medical product development, quality improvement, all of those things. So what do I mean when I say patient engagement? I'm referring to active, meaningful, authentic, collaborative interaction between patients and researchers across all stages of the research process. And this particular definition refers to research, but you could substitute the word research for any other kind of activity where the decision-making is guided by the patient contributions as partners, recognizing their unique experiences, values, and expertise. And this is actually a definition that comes from the International Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes Research, and it was recently published in the last year, where they undertook an effort to be able to really define what patient engagement means in the research process. But if you were to substitute that word research with other kinds of activities, you can see that it can fit across the board in many other places. Next slide, please. I also want to take a moment to distinguish something that very often gets confused, that there is a difference between something being patient-centered and it being a patient-reported outcome. So patient-centered outcomes and patient-reported outcomes certainly overlap with one another, and probably much more so than you see in my Venn diagram. I had to kind of lay it out this way so that you can still see the words, but they probably overlap more than this indicates. Patient-centered outcomes really refers to the outcomes that patients report are important to them. What are the things that they tell you are most important to them in their everyday lives? Patient-reported outcomes are outcomes that can only be reported by the patient and how they feel or how they function. Pardon me. So as you can imagine, these two things overlap considerably, but they're not exactly the same thing, because sometimes patients report things that are important to them that are not necessarily a patient-reported outcome. Sometimes they can be measured in other ways besides just gathering the information from patients. It can come from other sources. Pardon me, I need to take a sip. Forgive me. So I just want to be sure that that you all understand that when I refer to patient-centered outcomes and patient-reported outcomes, that I'm referring to two different things, but they are very closely related. Next slide, please. We don't seem to be moving to the next slide. I'm not sure if that's just for me. Oh, okay, there we go. So one of the things that I'd like to refer you to that can be a handy tool is something that we developed that's called our rubric to capture the patient voice. And this is essentially a little tool that the patient community or any other stakeholder could use when they're evaluating the attributes of patient-centeredness in the activity that they want to undertake. And it really helps to tell what good looks like. Next slide, please. And this is available for free on our website. You're welcome to go there. I want to just go over a couple of things that are in here. I don't want to dive into it because certainly you can look at that on your own. But the domains of patient centricity that we arrived at through a consensus process that we performed was that there are attributes of patient partnership. So in the activity, do you clearly see that there's patient partnership there and that there's meaningful engagement as part of that partnership? Do we get at the outcomes patients care about as a next domain? Is there transparency? Do the patients who are participating understand very clearly what this activity is about, what its objectives are, and how they are contributing and what their role can and should be? Is there representativeness in the patients that are involved? So do they truly represent the target population that you're going after when you're conducting the activity? Is there a diversity? So is there diversity that's meaningful in terms of the disease that might be represented or other parts of the activity that might need to be represented? Is patient-centered data considered, and are patient-centered data sources used? Meaning, are they really data sources that get at the things that are important to patients that patients have actually contributed to? And then there's their timeliness. Timeliness meaning that are we actually conducting these activities in a way that patients can contribute? The difference between having patients be engaged and being in partnership to co-develop something versus giving patients or patient groups something that's already completed and asking them to approve it or asking them to comment on it in a very short time period, which doesn't really allow them to contribute. So timeliness is extremely important. So these are the domains of patient centricity that are outlined in the rubric with more detail. Next slide, please. So I want to give you an example of what meaningful patient engagement looks like in the rubric. It refers to direct relationships and partnerships that are bidirectional. They're reciprocal, they're continuous. It's not a one and done situation. The communications are open, honest, and clear. And the engagement goals, the participants' methods, desired impacts, and actual impacts are clearly outlined and transparent. So that's what we use when we describe what meaningful patient engagement looks like in the rubric. Next slide, please. So here's an example of what the rubric looks like, and I chose an example that I think people might be able to relate to. When we talk about outcomes that are important to patients, that they're identified and incorporated, and these include outcomes that are functional status, symptoms, health-related quality of life, well-being, sometimes clinical measures, because patients will report that a clinical measure or keeping a clinical measure in a normal range is important to them because they've learned over time with their illness that that's an important state for them. Survival, productivity, meeting their goals, expectations and aspirations, and also the financial stress that they might be under in trying to pay for their care, or the loss of wages. So in the rubric, we state that an example of what meaningful engagement would look like is that researchers partnered with a patient organization to identify a disease-specific outcome measure that might be used as a patient-reported outcome measure. After speaking directly with the patients, it was determined that the new measure should be a patient-reported outcome measure, and patients were involved throughout the development and validation process for that new outcome measure. So that's an example of where patients were meaningfully engaged throughout the process, as opposed to something that would be insufficient or low, where a previous developed patient-reported outcome measure was included in a clinical trial. It was included as an exploratory endpoint to try to improve the patient centricity of the study. However, the measure was not developed with patient input, and it did not reflect for this patient population the outcomes that are most important to them. So that in this case would be an example of either negligible or very low engagement as opposed to meaningful engagement. So the rubric has examples like this to help guide on what good looks like in terms of meaningful patient engagement. The next slide, please. So I want to get to the true crux of what we're talking about today, now that everyone has a really good idea of what my perspective and the National Health Council's perspective is of patient centricity and patient engagement in an activity. When we talk about core outcome sets, we talk about patient-centered core outcome sets, because I think it's important that patients are involved, they're engaged, and it really focuses on the things that are important to them. So we define this as an agreed upon standardized set of outcomes, often with those related measures and or endpoints that might be identified, but not always, that should be gathered and reported at minimum in research in specific areas of health or healthcare. The outcome concept identification, that process of identifying what concepts are important to patients, and the prioritization of what patients prefer are guided by patient contributions as partners, recognizing their unique experiences, values, and expertise. So you can see that this definition stems from the previous definitions that I talked about a little bit earlier, but it really means that patients are an integral part of the process and that they are working hand in glove with a team that's developing the patient-centered outcome set, core outcome set. Next slide, please. So I have an elaborate diagram here, but I'm going to walk through it, and I think it will make sense once I talk through it a little bit. So what should be the process for a patient-centered core outcome set that demonstrates that patients have been engaged? So up on the left-hand side, upper left, you see patient engagement, where we identify what matters to patients. We see engagement of other stakeholders because we also want to know what's important to them. And then typically there's some type of environmental scan where we look at what's come out of the literature, what do we know already, what's been used in the past, what are the concepts, measures, and endpoints that have already been studied. From there, we come up with a pool of candidate outcome concepts that we should consider, that we should think about. And we go through a structured consensus process, and different organizations have different ways of doing that. But typically there should be methodological rigor that's applied there. We want to see it be structured, transparent, multi-stakeholder. And so through that process, we come out with what those high priority concepts are that should be considered in the core outcome set. And so there's some possible domains that we put in the center of the slide here: symptoms, function, physical status, mental health, physiological measures, etc. Those are things that could typically end up in the core outcome set. And then we go through the process on the upper right-hand side of measure selection and development. But again, you see there's a dotted line there. Patients should be engaged in this process along the way, just as they've been very critical to the achieving what those concepts look like, how we got to the concepts, and now how we're getting to the measures. So then when we get to the measure selection and development, we look for alignment between core concepts and existing measures. Does that exist? And that could tell us whether we could adapt, or do we need to build something new based on what we know about what's out there that exists already. And then we determine, are these fit for purpose? Are they psychometrically, do they have the characteristics that would make them acceptable? In the language of the Food and Drug Administration, are they something that could be qualified as a COA or qualified as a biomarker? Are they fit for purpose? That adds another layer, sometimes necessary because of regulatory purposes, sometimes not. But through that process, we come out with a core set of measures. They could be clinical outcome assessments, such as patient-reported outcomes, but it could be other specific measures, sometimes things like biomarkers and survival, or other things that patients have told us are important to them when it comes to experiencing their disease and their everyday life. From there, we go to study endpoints, getting finer and more granular in this process. And then when the studies are completed and it's integrated, it could be used in a number of different ways. So these study endpoints could be used in clinical trials. They could be identified in real-world studies if we have some existing data that includes those endpoints. It could be in medical product development, quality measurement, value assessment, or health technology assessment, and value-based agreements. So you see this whole circular process here of how we incorporate the patient into this process as an integral partner in the process, but that there are many downstream uses for what could come out of this process. And this is a very simplified structure that I put together here. It doesn't necessarily mean to indicate that you would get only one core set of measures and that they would be used under all circumstances. Of course, there would have to be some adaptation for different scenarios, different circumstances, different uses, but it at least gives everyone the same structure to work from and to be able to leverage the work that's been done in the past. So this is a suggested framework in thinking through how patients can be involved, how they should be involved, but also how those possible uses, those downstream uses, are important to be reflecting what's important to patients because they get used in everyday decision-making by patients and with regard to patients. The next slide, please. So what's the goal and what's needed here? For us, patient centricity is the core. We would like to see more patient leadership, partnership, engagement. And of course, we need some more capacity building. We need patients to have the capacity to be able to engage, patient groups to be able to engage in this process. And so they need to have some new knowledge and training. But we also need for the individuals who are working through core outcome sets and are wanting to bring patients into the process to also have capacity building to learn how to work and engage with patients in the patient community. And then we want core outcome sets to serve as a foundation for a wide variety of healthcare activities, such as the ones that I was discussing on the previous slide. So in research, in real world evidence research, in policy, in quality measurement, all of those kinds of things, so that those downstream uses are well informed by the core outcome set. What do we need? We need to all be on the same page by standardizing terms, methodologies, approaches, but we don't want to be overly prescriptive because we still want to be able to innovate in this area and be efficient. And some of the times those innovations really help us with efficiency. We need collaboration. We need multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary collaboration. And that of course means patients being part of that. We need some flexibility to support innovation in advancing measures and methods. And we need some infrastructure. Platforms. We need to be able to map between existing tools. We need quality assurance to be sure that it's being done well. One of the things that we've been talking about in the US is some funding for core outcome sets to be sure that there's a way of getting this work done. We need to be able to have the funds to get the work done. And we definitely need coordination among the patient groups. And at least in the US, the National Institute for Health, the Food and Drug Administration, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So all of those organizations that could be helping to initiate core outcome sets and ensure that they're done properly, but also the ones that are looking at downstream uses for the data that comes out of them. Last slide, please. So I want to thank you and happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Eleanor. That's fantastic and very, very clear. If it's okay, we're asking people to post questions in the chat function. So you'll see that at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll take those at the end of the presentations. So we've got 2 more speakers now for you. First of all, we've got, well, a joint presentation from Heather Bagley and John Turner. Heather and John are going to be talking about resources that have been developed by the COMET PoPPIE working group to support patient involvement and engagement in core outcome set development. So as I say, after Heather and John's talk, we've got time for questions and we'll take those. And both Heather and John are happy to introduce themselves. So I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, we're just waiting to, there we are. Hello. Oh, can we go back one, Heather? Isn't technology marvelous? We'll be with you shortly, folks. Now is the time to make a cup of tea. There we go. Right. My name is John Turner. I'm co-chair of PoPPIE. I'm the one on the left there, and it is amazing what Photoshop can do, for those of you who can see the video. I'm the new kid on the block. I have only recently joined PoPPIE as co-chair. I have been involved in core outcome set development for Diabetes UK as a volunteer and as a somebody with type 2 diabetes. So this is something that I'm fairly new at, but very, very keen to encourage. I'm taking over from Rosemary Humphrey, who apparently left me with some impressive shoes to fill. So please, as I say, I'm the new kid on the block, so be gentle with me. So can I now introduce Heather, my colleague?
Hi, thanks, John. So I'm Heather. I've just changed my name, actually, just got married. So I'm Heather Barrington now. You'll know me as Heather Bagley if I've worked with you previously. So yeah, I'm the Patient Public Involvement Coordinator for the COMET initiative. I've been doing it since 2012, and I got involved initially as a parent of a child who'd taken part in a clinical trial, and I attended the first COMET meeting as a parent. So I kind of still have 2 hats in that sense. I have another hat as well now. So I've just started my PhD in this area, and I'll tell you more about that later. Okay, I'll hand over to myself actually. So just a first note on terminology, because you'll notice that across the waters from ourselves and Eleanor, we're using different terminology, which is very confusing. But so I just want to acknowledge that the terms that I'll use will be based on my work in the UK. So when patients take part in a core outcome set study, for example, taking part in a survey to rate the importance of outcomes, I'll be referring to that as participation. When patients help the study team to design and oversee a core outcome set study to help ensure that it will be accessible for the public to take part in, I refer to that as patient involvement. When I talk about public engagement, I refer to our work in raising awareness of both the need for core outcome sets and the work of the COMET initiative. So just for a little bit of history now. So in March 2014, COMET held its first involving people meeting with public involvement organisations, core outcome set developers and the COMET initiative. And discussions at that meeting resulted in the development of COMET's public involvement strategy. In order to take this strategy forward, COMET set up the PoPPIE working group, and you'll see the members of the PoPPIE working group on the slide. This group, as you'll have heard, is co-chaired by John, who obviously has participated in the core outcome set, and Bridget, who's our chair today, who's got a special interest in ensuring the distinctive perspectives of patients and carers and members of the public are taken into account in the development of core outcome sets. We've got another public member on the PoPPIE working group who's been a public research partner in core outcome set studies. We have representation from 2 patient organisations that have been involved in core outcome set development. We have 2 research funders involved and another researcher with an interest in patient participation and involvement in core outcome sets. PoPPIE has also established a volunteer associate panel, which includes patients and with and without experience of core outcome set development. We've got core outcome set developers who've included patients in their work that are involved in that group, and patient organisations that have a particular interest in core outcome set development. The associate panel provides us with invaluable contributions by providing feedback on PoPPIE resources that we're developing. More information on those groups is available on the COMET website. If you're interested, you can contact me about those.
Okay, before we go on to provide our update, I wanted to let you know that the resources that we were talking about today are all on the COMET website. So we just wanted to show you very briefly how to find those. The COMET website, you'll see on the left-hand side there, we have our own Patients and Public tab at the top of the COMET website. Couldn't fit our whole name on a tab. And within that tab, there are resources for patients, for patient organisations, and for researchers who are including patients in their work. This is also where you can find out more about PoPPIE. Heather?
So why is PoPPIE needed and what are the challenges? So within COMET and PoPPIE, we're learning from core outcome set developers what some of the key challenges are when they strive to include patients in the core outcome set work. At the COMET face-to-face meetings, we've run work challenges and to identify methods used by core outcome set developers to address some of these. Bridget and I have produced a summary of our learning from these international workshops. We've also learned a lot from the work of Alice Began, who has done work around patient participants' experience of taking part in core outcome set development, and from a workshop that we ran with a group of young people at the ICANN summit, which was held in Edinburgh a couple of years ago, and it's an international consortium of youth advisory groups. Those papers are published relating to the published papers relating to this learning are available on the COMET website. So in terms of what we've learned, what's some of the key issues really? So understanding what outcomes are, what an outcome be more than a cure. So moving people along from saying, I just want a cure. What are the actual outcomes? What core outcome sets are and what the consensus process is, and the perspective that should be used when completing the surveys in Delphi surveys in core outcome set work. There are issues around finding participants, especially a challenge where there's no patient organisation that exists, for example, in many acute conditions. Ensuring appropriate methods, does the method suit the patient community? And inclusivity, how inclusive is the core outcome set development process? And accessibility, how can we best design the process for patients to take part in? I'll just hand over now. Sure.
Okay. To address one of the key challenges of helping patients to understand what core outcome sets are and why they're needed, we've worked with patients designing 2 resources to help patients and the public. We have on our website a core outcome set plain language summary. Any of you who've ever read some of the more technical terminology towards core outcome sets knows that this was very much needed. And also our core outcome set animation, which is brilliant and well worth having a look at. We know that already some core outcome set developers have found the plain language summary especially useful in helping them to design their participant information sheets. Similarly, we're hearing from teams using our core outcome set animation to help them explain core outcome sets to their patients. We are really keen to encourage core outcome set developers to use our resources, and all that we ask is that COMET is acknowledged. Our animation lasts just over 3 minutes. It's available with subtitles in 12 languages and has had over 5,500 views so far. All the feedback suggests that it's not only useful, it's a very understandable tool. We recognise also that the consensus building process can be challenging to explain, to say the least. I've been through it and I had to read our own plain language guides to understand exactly what had happened. So again, with patients, we've developed 2 plain language summaries about both the Delphi method and the nominal group technique, which again are available on the website.
So in terms of raising awareness of COMET and core outcome sets, COMET is one of the founding members of the International Patient-Public Involvement Network. And the mission of the network is working together, we'll build a global partnership that shares knowledge and promotes, supports and strengthens patient and public involvement in health research. We hope that COMET's involvement with this network provides useful links to patient and public involvement organisations internationally, and that these links will prove useful to core outcome set developers. The network also provides an opportunity to promote our work internationally. For example, we've shared our animation through it. There are over 300 people who have registered an interest from 20 countries in that network. Over the past 2 years, COMET has also held 2 patient webinars designed specifically for patient organisations. Both webinars have included the perspective of patients who have participated in core outcome set studies and patient organisations that have worked with core outcome set teams in developing core outcome sets. We received excellent feedback on the webinars, as you can see, and they've been recorded and are available on the COMET website. They're both well worth a watch and might be useful if you're working or planning on working with a patient organisation in your core outcome set.
Okay, some of the key messages from the webinars are on the screen. Patients found that working with core outcome set development is empowering. It brings the patients to the decision-making table. It has benefits for both the patients or patient organisations and core outcome set developers. And they're far too important to sit on a shelf gathering dust. I wouldn't disagree with any of those. When we had one of the webinars, I called for a core outcome set revolution. That's because as a patient who was recently involved in developing a core outcome set for type 2 diabetes, I felt for the first time I could make a difference. I could fight back against this condition that had taken me over, and I was part of the solution. Even better was the response from the clinicians and researchers who joined me on the journey to a core outcome set. They came to me and told me that my perspective was not just valued, but also valuable in supporting and developing their work. And I do hope that any of you today who haven't joined the COS revolution, join it. Over to you, Heather.
So some other resources and links that we've got available. So we have a number of resources around consensus meetings. We've got information about assessing venue accessibility. Taking part in a consensus meeting. We've got a couple of little stories from patients who've taken part in core outcome sets consensus meetings, in case you wanted to share those in terms of explaining to patients what to expect. We've got a resource which is our tips for designing an accessible consensus meeting. We've got a consensus meeting evaluation form, a template, and we're currently piloting a slide set for patient pre-meetings held just at the start of a consensus meeting. So the pre-meetings where you might start to explain what to expect as they go into the consensus meeting. And we're just piloting those at the moment. If anybody's interested in finding out more about those sort of things, just get in contact with me. We've also got links to some relevant articles on the website, and we've got some links to other websites as well. So around things like preparing information for patients, we've got useful links to help core outcome set developers with those kinds of things. So just over to me again. So my PhD focuses on optimising patient participation in core outcome set studies. I aim to undertake a series of studies to explore several aspects of patient participation. The understanding gained will potentially enable me to improve patient participation by developing, implementing and evaluating an intervention. My initial work is a systematic review of core outcome set studies that have included patients in the Delphi papers between 2015 and 2019. I'm exploring the recruitment and retention of patients and other stakeholders in such studies. For example, I'm looking at things like the methods and sources of recruitment, the ratio of patients to professional core outcome set participants, reporting participant characteristics in studies, and whether studies have used piloting or patient public involvement in their design. I then intend to conduct interviews with a sample of core outcome set developers from the review and to explore more about the planning and delivery of recruitment and retention approaches in their studies, and to begin to collate participant-facing resources used in core outcome set studies. To understand what features and aspects of the design and language of the participant-facing resources make them accessible and engaging from a patient perspective, I'll be working with patients as well to look at those. And then I'll be moving on to a Think Aloud study to understand what people think about as they complete a Delphi. And then finally, I'll look to develop some form of intervention to evaluate.
Okay. In addition to developing resources to support patient participation in core outcome set studies, we're also keen to develop work around involving patients as public research partners in core outcome set studies, where the patients have a role in helping the study team design and oversee the core outcome set study itself. But we're also keen to hear about any resources that you might find helpful. We don't think we've got to the end of it yet. There's a lot more that needs to be done, but we need to know what you think. Before I finish, up on the screen there, you'll see we're going to give you a brief plug for a new COMET alert function. It's not there yet, but it will give patient organisations who sign up details or updates of newly published and registered core outcome sets in their areas, and offers to be contacted regarding participation. It also gives core outcome set developers the opportunity to register their interest in linking up with patient organisations in their area. I've been told to say it's like a dating function, but I'm a little bit nervous about suggesting that. Luckily, my wife can't overhear, so we're okay. As well as a standard notification function. COMET will be advertising when it's live, but if you'd like to register, just contact Sarah, who'll be keeping a list, and we'll let you know as soon as it's live. And from both Heather and myself, thank you very much for putting up with this ramble. And I hope we've been giving you some food for thought.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heather and John. Not a ramble at all, and fantastic to have hot off the press information, including about the intriguing data agency. So we've got quite a few questions, and some particularly for Eleanor. So if I could ask Nagawi, if you're still on the line, to open up your microphone and video and put your question, please.
Oh, hi, sorry, I wasn't expecting that. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I was just interested to see or to find out the different ways that people had funded the development. Do you fund it as part of a project, or yeah, just to get some inspiration around that?
So I can only speak for what's going on in the US, and they're funded in various ways, but I have to actually tell you that there aren't very many being funded. It's really a pretty nascent process in the US. So some are being funded by patient groups themselves. So I know of several patient groups that have invested in the funding to have a core outcome set developed for the clinical area that they're in, for the therapeutic area that they're in. And so an organization, for example, in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, has invested in developing a core outcome set for Duchenne's. So there are some small efforts like that going on, actually being funded by patient groups. Then there are some other consortium types of things happening where a group of pharmaceutical companies or one pharmaceutical company, if not a group, will fund a core outcome set in a particular clinical area. So we're seeing some of that happening. And then lastly, we're seeing a little bit of work being done by the government, and that's mostly done by the Food and Drug Administration. However, they're defining core outcome set fairly narrowly. They are doing some core outcome sets, but only for clinical outcome assessment. So only for those assessments that would be related to patient-reported, observer-reported, clinician-reported, or performance-based outcomes, but not getting beyond that. So it's a narrower definition. And the FDA has funded a small handful of core outcome sets there. We at the National Health Council are looking for some more funding for this kind of work. We're hoping that we have some opportunity in the coming year with some new legislation that might be putting forward, depending upon, of course, how elections go, that might be able to find some additional investments for some government influx through Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or through the FDA, or through other kinds of collaborative work that might go on between private and public organizations to get more off the ground.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Maybe we've got time to squeeze in a few more questions. So I'll go over to Paula, our own Paula Williamson, who has a question.
Oh, gosh, sorry. I wasn't expecting it either. So used to having those things where you have to score the questions. Right. Eleanor, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. My question, so in your experience, Eleanor, how often do patient organizations lead on core outcome set development and then reach out to find other stakeholder groups to collaborate with? And if it is rare, why do you think that may be?
Well, it is rare, definitely rare. I know of very few who have taken the lead on this. I know a number that have become involved when they were asked to become involved, but for them to take the lead, it's rare. And usually it's two things. One is just lack of knowledge about what a core outcome set is, and lack of knowledge about how they could lead on something like this and the value that it might have. And so we're trying to turn that around through capacity building. And then the other is funding. Many patient organizations just don't have the resources to be able to put in something like this. And I think we all recognize that this takes resources to do well.
Thank you again, Eleanor. So our next question comes from Sheila Dickinson. Sheila, if you'd like to put your question.
Hi, thanks for the very nice presentations. So I work for a pharmaceutical company, for Novartis, and I would be very keen to encourage my colleagues to use core outcome sets for drug development for the clinical studies there. How do we find core outcome sets that have indeed been developed with patient input?
Well, I think that's a really important question. I think, from our perspective, we look through the documentation that describes how the core outcome set was developed, and we look to see the level of patient engagement. And we, of course, refer to our rubric to see how the work that was done in the methods that are provided for the development work and the level of activity that patients were able to be involved in, and that the level of patient input that was there. And that helps us to gauge. So one of the things that I think is important is that anyone who is developing a core outcome set, be sure to include that kind of information in your documentation about how patients were engaged, because if it's not in that documentation, then no one's going to be able to tell whether or not it's patient-centered or not. I think also highlighting it and making it, you know, a really important a point that there was patient engagement and that it is a patient-centered core outcome set is, of course, one way to make sure that people pay attention to that. I do also think that we all have to be maybe informed buyers or savvy buyers, that just because someone tells us, this is not with regard to core outcome sets, but with regard to anything, just because someone tells us that something's been patient-centered, we should look at that and let that with a critical eye and be sure that it's true, because I've seen many things that say that they're patient-centered, but it's actually because it is about patients and not because patients were actually engaged. And so buyer beware, I guess is what I'm saying. You know, you have to look at the documentation and see what you can find about it. But I encourage everyone that if you have patients engaged, you know, be proud of that, because it's something that makes the work stand out.
Thanks.
Can I just ask very quickly, Sheila, your accent is sounding like it's from our side of the pond. Are you talking about specifically UK work or more in general?
So I am indeed from the UK. I currently live in Switzerland, but I work for an international pharmaceutical company, and I think it's important that the clinical research that we do uses, where available and where appropriate, core outcome sets that reflect input from patients. And I'm trying to figure out how do we do this? You know, what I would nice official stamp saying patient approved, and we just pick it up and use it. I think from what Eleanor is saying at this moment, we still have to do more work. So, John, does that answer your question about the background to my question?
It does a little, and what I would suggest, if I may, that perhaps email connection between COMET and yourself might help with some of the information with regard to what's happening on our shores, at least, and to a certain extent internationally, I suspect, as well.
Yeah, John, I would add to what Sheila was saying. I think one of the things that we would like to see, and this is when I was talking about all those downstream uses that can be quite broad. You know, one of the most valuable could be in medical product development, because I think at least in the U.S. and I know certainly with what's going on with FDA and EMA. That patient-focused drug development or patient-focused medical product development over the last 10 years or so has gotten much more attention, especially in the US with some legislation that's been passed to support that. So we're looking at how do we do better patient-focused medical product development. And my belief is that we can do a better job of it if we have core outcome sets that companies can rely on. We'll begin to see more consistency in the endpoints that get selected for the medical product development process, for the clinical trials, and that if we're at least all using the same framework for thinking about how this gets done, we could have more preclinical collaborative efforts, non-competitive collaborative efforts to come up with what those core outcome sets are, because they would help facilitate medical product development. And you know, as I was mentioning in my framework, we can gather those concepts, and we may or may not necessarily have measures for them. But if people at least know what the right concepts are, they know what the core patient-centered concepts are, then we can have more organizations focused on the right targets in their measurement development, rather than it being more of a scattershot all over the place.
So I agree with all of that. I would maybe add one more thing about why I think this is important, which is unless it's studied during drug development, it can't get in the label. And it's the label which will be critical to, you know, how the drug is, or what's known about the drug, and what's told to physicians and what's told to patients. So yeah.
Yeah, and I would add, because that is what ends up in the label, and it's used for patient and clinician decision making. The other place where it gets used is in access. So the label very often is the core piece of information that gets used to determine whether something's put on formulary, or if there are out-of-pocket costs, or all those kinds of things. And if the label focused on endpoints that patients don't care about, it's very difficult for patients to have access and make an understandable decision based on information that's not important to them, where the questions that they really have that are important to them don't get answered.
Yep, agree. Thank you.
Some really interesting discussion there. I'm conscious we're running a little bit over time. So if Heather, John and Eleanor agree, would you be happy to take a couple more questions?
Yeah, I'm free.
Yes, sure.
Fantastic, because we do seem to have a lot of questions. Any questions that we can't respond to, I think we'll endeavour to post a little follow-up note, given a response to questions where we can. So just moving on, we have a question from Maddie. Maddie, are you still there? Perhaps Maddie isn't there, so I'll move over to a question from Jamlik, and this also came from Yasser as well, the same query. Jamlik, are you there? Perhaps?
Yes, can you hear me?
Fantastic, yes.
Yeah, great presentation, Eleanor. I think the question really is, when we are looking at patient organizations, some of these low and middle income countries don't have organized patient groups, so to say. So what's your take about involving patient in those areas? Just a comment or your take based on your experience.
Yeah, I think everyone has to recognize that patient advocacy group is relying on a patient advocacy group can be very helpful, very supportive, but it's not going to solve all problems. So as Jamlik says, there are some areas that don't have patient advocacy organizations, or the organizations are involved in different kinds of work. They're not involved in advocacy, but they're maybe involved in service provision, which is a little bit different kind of work. I think you have to keep in mind that you have to find a variety of sources to be able to tap into patient populations, and you can't rely on just one. So as much as I promote that you should talk to patient advocacy organizations, and I believe that, I don't promote that it's the only way to go, that you should think about other ways to reach out. Sometimes that can be through clinical contacts, through clinics, through physicians, but you have to also remember that you're sometimes getting a slanted view from that perspective also, because they may also only be in contact with some of the sickest patients. So you really have to think about the broader view. Developing relationships in communities is very important for this kind of work. And that relationship development can be through a variety of sources that make sense for the circumstance. So for example, in the city of Baltimore in Maryland in the US, Baltimore is a large city. It has some parts of it that have very underserved populations. And these are populations that have been resistant to being involved in research activities or any kind of activities that might be related to the university, because there is a cultural, not rejection, but in some cases suspicion and fear of science and research. We have organizations within our university that have spent many years developing community relationships in order to break down those barriers. So it's work that gets done through community centers, through churches, through barbershops and beauty salons, and any place where people might congregate for a while, where there's trust in the relationships there. But those relationships don't happen overnight. It does take relationship building in those smaller community circumstances. So I think you have to think about being open and creative in how you do outreach to patients. And then of course, in this time of COVID, using technology when it's available is also one of the ways to really expand the opportunities for having outreach to different kind of patients in the community through different sources. So it takes creativity, but it also takes investment in time and resources, because it doesn't happen overnight, and it's needed in many circumstances to be able to talk to what we would call real patients.
Thank you again, Eleanor. I think we can go, perhaps it would be worth people having a look on the chat, because some of the questions we've got responses to already. People are quick off the mark here. But we have a question, and I think this will be our last, from Victoria. Victoria, are you there?
Hi Bridget, yes I am, thanks. Thank you everybody for some brilliant talks. I was just interested, it's great to hear about all the resources available on the COMET website, but they all seem to be quite adult focused. Is there anything that anybody knows of that's been developed to help kind of children and young people engage with the core outcome set development process?
So we put up on the website also, there's something around, we went to a meeting with some children and young people in Edinburgh, and we discussed, you know, the resource, what resources are traditionally used in core outcome set processes, and we got some useful feedback from that. But I'm not sure yet that I've collated any resources around those used with children and young people. I don't know whether Eleanor, have you got any resources?
I haven't seen any specifically. I do know that, as I mentioned earlier, the Duchenne's muscular dystrophy group has done some work in core outcome set development, and that is a group that does work with the patients who are usually children, in teenagers, and then also their parents and their families. So I would imagine they may have had to have done some specific work in that particular condition, but I don't know that they've made those resources available. I haven't seen them. It's definitely an area where much more work needs to be done.
Victoria, can I ask what prompts your question? Where are you coming from?
So I'm a paediatric physiotherapist. I'm based in Newcastle, and I've done some previous work developing core outcome sets very badly, and I'm interested in doing some further work going forward. I've got a grant at the minute. Actually, I've spoken and visited Bridget before, so hi Bridget.
Hi.
But yeah, I'm interested going forward at looking at developing some more, but really developing with kind of co-design, true co-design, some much broader core outcome sets for use in paediatric conditions, because a lot that exist are very kind of medically focused.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, again, if I, at the risk of sounding repetitive, but I think we need to be talking at some stage by email at least to have a chat about.
Bridget's got my details. That's fine.
So we also have a couple of responses on the chat, and Paula, you look like you've got a comment.
Well, no, I just wanted to mention that, so this is a big area of interest for methods research, and we have a group within something called the Trials Methodology Research Partnership, which covers many more trial issues and research issues than outcomes. But there is a group around core outcome sets specifically looking at methods. And so if you have an interest in methods for involving children and young people in core outcome set development, it would be great to have you involved in that group. It is open, it's international, it's public and industry people, anybody with an active interest in the methods. It would be great to rope you in. So
yeah, absolutely. I think I've spoken to you before as well, actually, Paula, on the phone. I think you were kind enough to spend some time talking to me a couple of years ago.
Next meeting is in about 3 weeks' time, so either email me or Sarah. Would be delighted to bring you all in, anyone that's doing work in this area.
Yeah, no, that would be brilliant. Thank you.
Hi, Bridget.
Thank you to all of our speakers, Eleanor, John and Heather, for some fantastic presentations. And thank you to our audience as well for some really interesting and very useful questions. If there are any that we haven't quite covered, we will try and go through those and get back to people. But if you have a look at the chat, there are quite a few useful responses and suggestions for resources there. So thank you everyone once again, and just a little mention for the next COMET webinar, which will be the 4th, and that's on the 3rd of November. And that's going to be an exciting range of contributed sessions on core outcome set development. So look forward to seeing you all again then. And thank you very much again, everyone, for joining us, and particularly our speakers for fantastic presentations. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.